I thought I would provide a video to go along with the answer key, to hopefully cover any questions that maybe aren't specifically typed. Feel free to skip ahead if there's particular questions you have. And I'm just going to go through and kind of point out some things to focus on. So, Islam, how did it spread and why did it spread? The main thing here is trade, right? That's the main thing that's going to cause Islam to spread. We know as the Islamic Empire grew, so did trade networks. And those trade networks are going to spread across North Africa and down into West Africa across the Sahara, and similarly spread into East Africa. Another key thing from this section is to know that often the first people converted, it was more practical, making that connection with the Islamic trader. Maybe if I'm Muslim, he'll choose me to do business versus a competitor. And then, of course, with anything, it's a religion. So there's appeal. Your children will be raised Muslim. It's a little different in East and West, which we'll go on to next. Um, in the West, it's slightly later. It's got to spread across North and then down South. In West, it mostly stays with the rulers and the elites, although I'm sure other people converted. And many who did convert blend their traditions. So it's perfectly fine to keep some old traditions blended with the new Islam. Go to school, learn Arabic, read the Quran, but also at home in your village, perhaps keep your traditional religion. Um, One appeal of the religions always is the literacy and the schools that are created to teach children how to read the Quran and write. Particularly for elites, that's an opportunity to, um, for your children to raise in status being literate, especially when you're talking about uh, most of the people who have the wealth in both East and West Africa would be merchants. Okay. East Africa is a little bit more intense, the impact. And what I mean by that is the conversion rates in the city states specifically. So, not in all of East Africa, but in the city states on the coast are much higher to the point where we'll get to this later. But one of the myths of Africa is that it was actually colonized by Arabs because the culture um, becomes Muslim, Arabic, and we know it's the new Swahili culture that's developed. The other thing that you should remember about East Africa is it's a lot more direct contact. So it's direct contact with Arab merchants sailing on their boats down directly to the cities, but also they're going to have more kind of international contact. Um, so you have kind of a more international flavor in your cities in East Africa in general. Um, Another key distinction here is that mostly the Islam stays in the city states, but the conversion rates are really high, like probably in the 90 something percent of the residents. And of course, Swahili culture is this new distinct culture that's a blending of traditional East African with particularly Arab Muslim, although it's viewed as being kind of um, urban, so like a city-based kind of culture, and kind of worldly, right? Kind of more diverse, accepting of differences. Um, yeah. The language, so it's a culture and a language. So the language is specifically Bantu, which originated at one point in West Africa and migrated across the continent, mixed with Arabic, which they're picking up from the Arab Muslim merchants and also obviously using for the religion. For the indigenous practices, just know it's polytheistic. Um, and that even in East Africa, where most people in the city states convert to Islam, it's a kind of an African version of Islam. So mosques look slightly different, they're decorated differently. Some of the practices, even when they're fully devout Muslims, still keep a flavor of the traditional religion, like burial practices. And, they're going to mix some holidays with traditional African holidays. Um, so that's not an exact replica of Arab. When I mean Arab, I mean Arabian Peninsula, as in, the original Muslims, where Muhammad's from. Um, the original sort of version of Islam is going to morph, just like many religions do as they spread from the place of their origin. The next part, you can read through some specifics. What I did here is the first three are from West Africa. So Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, all the yellow. Their key characteristics is they all get wealthy from the gold salt trade. And I put a little note here, just to explain it. There's no salt in sub Saharan West Africa. There is a question on the importance of salt used to preserve food, and our bodies obviously, need salt. And it doesn't exist naturally in sub Saharan West Africa. They don't have a lot of access to the coast. And so it needs to be imported. What they do have in abundance in West Africa is gold. And it becomes almost at some points in the exchange, it's like an even trade, right? The value of salt in West Africa was equal to the value of gold. And so that's going to be the driver for the merchants because there's a huge demand for gold in Europe where they have very little. And Europe, as the Middle Ages go on, is wanting to get more connected to other markets and they need cash. And so estimates are somewhere between two-thirds and three-quarters of the gold that was minted and used in the Middle Ages in Europe at some point originated in West Africa. There is also gold coming out of East Africa that's going to more go into like the other trade routes in the East. Some other key things you should know. Just generically, Sundiata, he's the founder of Islam. I think the question about him is possibly tied to griots. It's one of the most famous West African griot stories that is told is the founding of the Malian Empire. You should know Mansa Musa, right? What he did and why he's so famous. So it's more than just his Hajj. He was also a very powerful ruler. He's ruling Mali at the height of its empire. Um, and one thing we now know from looking at medieval sources is, they knew in Europe and other places in the world that there were powerful kingdoms in Africa, right? The contemporaries, the people who are living at the same time. It's only later on, after Africa's colonized and after the slave trade, that the myths about Africa, specifically from the Europeans, start to rise. Okay, sorry, scholars. Songhai is the largest empire in West Africa. This is sort of the height, and it's actually the end. So one of the reasons for the fall of Songhai is they're captured by the North Africans, but also they're going to be toward the end when the Europeans are going to come. The two I put in blue are the East African city-states. And so I just talk about, what they all have in common. It's important to know that they're all autonomous, which means they all have their own government. They all have, they're all basically like little mini kingdoms. We combine them together because they have the three shared qualities: trade, religion, and language. The other thing they all have in common is they're all part of the same trade network. So the monsoon wind trade network, the monsoon winds on the Indian Ocean trade. So people had known about the monsoon winds since ancient times, but essentially the monsoon winds are these predictable wind patterns that part of the year the direction of the wind goes north from the coast of Africa up through the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula and to India. And then it switches. And then the second half of the year, it blows south. So you don't need a lot of like navigational or maritime knowledge. You basically just need a boat with a sail. And if you can catch the winds and time it right, it's a pretty consistent, easy trade. And that's what they're using in East Africa. And it's international. So you would have merchants traveling from India, Arabia, Egypt. We have some Chinese are going to come all the way. We know that one great Chinese sailor was all the way down in Kilwa. We know that Southeast Asian merchants, spice merchants, are going to be there as well. And because of that, they have a wider range of goods that they're selling. You can put more in a boat than you can on the back of a camel. Let's see. You should know the type of goods that they're selling, what they're importing and exporting. Great Zimbabwe is connected to East Africa, but it's in an interior city. And so it's going to be known for its large walls. and it's going to be rich because of taxing. It's really the last stop if you want to get your goods from the interior. So you're hunting ivory